The Civil War Battle Series, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Shortly after dawn on June 27, 1864, Union artillery crews sprang into action on 200 guns, facing miles of Confederate defenses along the Kennesaw Line near Marietta, Georgia. Jostled and jarred awake by the tremendous barrage, Private Sam Watkins and his fellow riflemen of the 27th Tennessee Regiment stood up in their trenches and watched, enthralled, as hundreds of Yankees surged toward them from the Federal lines just 400 yards away. Although the concentrated shelling did little more than alert the defenders that a ground attack was imminent, the Confederates marveled at the volume and the intensity of the fire. To them, it was one more manifestation of Yankee wealth and ingenuity. All at once, 100 guns from the Federal line opened upon us, and for more than an hour they poured their solid and chain shot, grape, and shrapnel right upon this point, wrote Watkins. For the next 3 hours, one tightly packed Federal column after another charged into the teeth of the Confederate rifle fire. The stakes that day could not have been higher. After his advance into North Georgia had stalled in the rain and mud just 20 miles from Atlanta, Major General William T. Sherman had decided to launch an all-out frontal assault against the entrenched positions of General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army of Tennessee in the hope of bringing the campaign to a rapid, decisive end. A Union breakthrough in strength somewhere along the line would split Johnston's army, lead to the capture of Marietta and a Yankee drive to the Chattahoochee River, and ultimately the capture of Atlanta. Such a string of events would prove catastrophic for the Confederacy and might result in the South's surrender. For these reasons, the Kennesaw Line had to be held at all hazards, according to Johnston and his lieutenants. In March of 1864, the American Civil War neared its fourth year, and newly promoted Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant prepared to head east to Washington to assume his duties as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant chose Sherman to succeed him as commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi, a sprawling swath of territory that encompassed most of the war's western theater. Grant's instructions to his fellow Ohioan for the upcoming campaign were straightforward. Sherman was to move south from Chattanooga, Tennessee, along the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and not only destroy Johnston's army, but also systematically demolish the enemy's industrial capabilities. The petulant Sherman began his advance into Georgia on May 4th with an army group numbering 98,000 men against Johnston's 49,000. But the terrain favored the Southerners, for behind Johnston lay 100 miles of mountain ranges, rivers, and tangled forests. It was ground that would prove a formidable ally to the Confederate defenders. Sherman's invasion force consisted of 3 armies, 60,000 men of Major General George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, 25,000 men of Major General James McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, and 13,000 men of Major General John Schofield's Army of the Ohio. Johnston's Army of Tennessee during the Atlanta campaign consisted of Lieutenant General William Hardee's Corps, Lieutenant General John Bell Hood's Corps, and Major General Joseph Wheeler's Cavalry Corps. When Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk's 16,000-man Army of the Mississippi joined Johnston's army in May, it raised the number of Johnston's troops to 65,000 men. Johnston had established a strong position west of Dalton on Rocky Face Ridge, astride the Western and Atlantic Railroad 25 miles south of Chattanooga, where he awaited the Federal advance. Sherman responded by commencing a series of flanking movements that resulted in Johnston withdrawing into Resaca on May 12th. After 2 days of hard fighting near Resaca, Johnston withdrew south to Cassville on May 15th to avoid being outflanked. Believing he had an opportunity to strike Sherman a telling blow, Johnston ordered a major attack at Cassville on May 19th. Johnston's plans called for Polk's Corps to draw the Union forces toward them so that Hood's Corps could strike them in the flank. But the usually aggressive Hood, alarmed by an erroneous report that a strong enemy force had unexpectedly gained his flank, pulled back and called off the attack. Afterward, Johnston fell back 10 miles to a new line south of the Etowah River. The Confederates established a new defensive position around Allatoona Pass. Johnston had no luck against the Yankees at Allatoona either, but Sherman was not about to launch a frontal assault on an entrenched enemy in a heavily fortified mountaintop position. At that point, Sherman decided to move away from the railroad line along which he had been advancing. Although he was stretching his supply line by moving away from the railroad, he nevertheless proceeded with the change in tactics. On May 22nd, he ordered his three armies to march west. Johnston matched his move and redeployed his troops south of Dallas. The Confederate line stretched 4 miles from Dallas to New Hope. After sharp fighting at New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and Dallas over the course of several days, beginning on May 25th, both armies remained stationary as weeks of torrential rain transformed Georgia's red clay roads into muddy quagmires. While senior commanders on both sides discussed strategy, the frontline troops skirmished and harassed each other with artillery and sniper fire on a daily basis. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis grew restive over Johnston's strategy of trading territory for time. On the northern side, Sherman became increasingly concerned about the deteriorating tactical situation. He believed all three of his armies were in danger of losing their fighting edge. "My chief source of trouble is with the Army of the Cumberland, which is dreadfully slow," he told Grant in mid-June. "A fresh furrow in a plowed field will stop the whole column, and all begin to entrench." He explained to Grant that despite his best efforts, some of the senior commanders, particularly the Army of the Cumberland commander, Major General George Thomas, were reluctant to press the attack despite repeated admonishments. The two armies gradually shifted their lines eastward until both were astride the railroad just north and west of Marietta. Fearing envelopment, on June 19th, Johnston withdrew his army into prepared entrenchments along Big Kennesaw Mountain and its spurs, where pioneers working around the clock, digging trenches and erecting fortifications, had converted the works into an earthen fortress. After judging the Kennesaw Line too formidable to take by direct assault, which ironically he would try to do a few days later, Sherman sent Major General Joseph Hooker's 15,000-man 20 Corps to probe Johnston's left flank south of Powder Springs Road. Johnston countered by pulling Hood's corps out of the line and sending it south and west along Powder Springs Road to extend the Confederate left flank. Hood, who commanded 14,000 men, was in position by June 22nd. In the mistaken notion that he had outflanked a Union flanking force, Hood impetuously attacked Hooker that afternoon near Peter Cobb's farm without reconnoitering the area. The Yankees repulsed the Confederates, inflicting more than 1,000 casualties on Hood, more than 3 times the number suffered by the Yankees in just a few hours of fighting. With his troops requiring 65 rail cars of supplies each day, Sherman fretted over his single-track lifeline. A significant interruption to his long supply line might cripple his campaign. With another turning movement on the muddy roads seemingly impossible, Sherman also feared Johnston might take advantage of the stalemate to dispatch troops to reinforce General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Sherman was infuriated when he learned that his detractors had deemed him as someone who was not a hard fighter, and he decided to refute to charge once and for all. Sherman believed Johnston was anticipating another turning movement and that the Confederate commander had thinned his line in response to flanking probes. "I am now inclined to feign with both flanks and assault the center," Sherman told U.S. Army Chief of Staff Major General Henry Halleck on June 16th. "It may cost us dear, but the results would surpass an attempt to pass around." For that reason, on June 24th, Sherman issued a special field order directing his 3 army commanders to reconnoiter the Confederate positions to their front in force at 8 a.m. on June 27th. To minimize the cost if the offensive failed, Sherman limited the weight of the assault to less than a fifth of the troops on hand, and giving up the element of surprise, ordered an hour-long artillery barrage to precede the attack. Neither of Sherman's two primary attacks was directed against Confederate forces on Big Kennesaw proper, although McPherson was demonstrated against it to keep Johnston from guessing the true location of Sherman's main attack. Sherman assigned the heaviest assault to Thomas, who Sherman instructed to attack the Confederates at any point near the center of their line using his own judgment. Sherman also directed Schofield to conduct a limited attack against Hood's corps on the Confederate left to confuse Johnston as to where the primary attack would fall. After Sherman and Schofield reconnoitered Hood's heavily fortified 2-mile front on the morning of June 25th, Sherman modified the order for the attack against the Confederate extreme left flank. Schofield and Hooker would instead feint against Hood's line on the following morning, while Brigadier General Jacob Cox led his division down Sandtown Road and attempt to establish a foothold on the east side of the Oiley's Creek. Sherman hoped that this would compel Johnston to shift troops from his center to his left, thereby weakening his center and making it vulnerable to a breakthrough on June 27th. As it happened, one of Cox's brigades, which was commanded by Colonel Robert Byrd, crossed the creek on June 26th and seized a hill on good defensive ground. In doing so, Byrd had actually turned Johnston's left flank, but the achievement went largely unnoticed. Because he was short on manpower, Johnston made no attempt to dislodge Byrd's brigade. Schofield, therefore, was free to exploit the unexpected opportunity on the day scheduled for the main attack. After a brief preparatory artillery barrage, McPherson's skirmishers pushed up the steep slopes of Big Kennesaw at 8:30 a.m. on June 27th. Their objective was to keep Johnston from shifting troops from there to other parts of the field. Brigadier General Mortimer Leggett and Brigadier General Walter Gresham's 17th Corps skirmishers confronted the rebel defenders of Major General William Loring's corps. Loring had assumed command of Polk's corps after its commander was killed by an artillery shell on June 14th while observing Union troops positioned atop Pine Mountain. The lack of underbrush and forest growth meant the defenders could see nearly every movement of the Federals as they left their works. For the Confederates, the attack was a magnificent sight. Presently, as if by magic, there sprung from the earth a host of men, and in one long, waving line of blue the infantry advanced, wrote Confederate Major General Samuel G. French, whose men were stationed opposite McPherson's Army of the Tennessee. Caught in a maelstrom of cannon and rifle fire, McPherson's Yankees, making the demonstration on the Union left, halted after a couple of hours, suffering approximately 400 casualties. To the right of McPherson's army, 3 brigades from Major General John Logan's 15th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee attacked east on a wide front. On the ridges of Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill, the Confederate brigades of Colonel William Barry and Brigadier General Francis Cockrell waited, their lines bent towards each other. The Confederates were positioned in the sector to pour deadly crossfire into any Yankee regiment that dared to enter the wooded slopes between Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. On Logan's left, Colonel Charles Walcott deployed the 46th Ohio in front in a skirmish line, followed by the 103rd Illinois and 6th Iowa in a first line of battle, and the 40th Illinois and 97th Indiana in the second. Stepping off shortly after 8 a.m., the 46th Ohio skirmishers struck the picket line 200 yards from the crest of Little Kennesaw, surprising and capturing a large number of rebel skirmishers, then rushed toward the southern slopes of Little Kennesaw. The men of the 6th Iowa and 103rd Illinois to the rear were struggling desperately in the dense undergrowth. Walking upright was hardly possible in the tangled vines, and the battle lines quickly unraveled in the dense vegetation. As the two rearward regiments came up, all five regiments merged into one confused mass of men. The men of the 40th Illinois on the left flank of Logan's attack got to within yards of Barry's trench line on the rugged slopes of Little Kennesaw before falling back. To Walcott's right, Brigadier General Giles Smith's men were deployed opposite Cockrell's Missouri Brigade. Although stretched thin behind their rock and dirt earthworks, the Missourians enjoyed excellent protection from the attackers' fire. They lay their rifle barrels on the top of the breastworks and picked off the Yankees as they came on. After forming his brigade into a front 3 regiments wide and 2 deep, his flank anchored on Burnt Hickory Road, Smith led his men forward through the dense forest and vegetation, struck Cockrell's skirmish line, and drove it back. After pausing to dress their lines, the Yankees rushed up the slope. Cockrell's Missouri Confederates were fighting against Union troops from their own state. Our infantry did not return their rammers as usual after loading, but struck them in the ground and snatched them up when wanted to save time, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Boyce of the Confederate 1st Missouri Infantry, who found it sickening to fight against fellow Missourians. No troops could stand such a concentrated fire long. Realizing the assault was futile, Union 2nd Division Commander Brigadier General Morgan Smith, who was Giles Smith's older brother, ordered the attacking units to fall back. An hour into Logan's attack, Cockrell requested reinforcements from French on Little Kennesaw to the north. French sent 2 groups of reinforcements, and he personally led the second group into battle. So severe and continuous was the cannonading that the volleys of musketry could scarcely be heard at all on the line, wrote French. Colonel Americus Rice's 57th Ohio made it far enough up the slopes to engage Colonel James McGowan's 3rd and 5th Consolidated Missouri Regiment at close range. But the Ohioans could only stand the withering fire from their entrenched foe for about 15 minutes before withdrawing down the slope. During the clash, Rice was struck by rebel fire in the right leg, left foot, and the forehead. The assaulting column had struck Cockrell's works near the center, recoiled under the fire, swung around into a steep valley, where exposed to the fire of the Missourians in front and right flank and of Sears' men on the left, it seemed to melt away or sink into the earth to rise no more, wrote French, who observed the attack. On Giles Smith's right flank, just south of Burnt Hickory Road, the Yankees of Brigadier General Joseph Lightburn's brigade formed into 2 lines, each of which consisted of 3 regiments. They surged forward against the right wing of Major General William Walker's division, held by Brigadier General Hugh Mercer's 4 Georgia regiments. 6 companies of the inexperienced 63rd Georgia were posted in Mercer's front as skirmishers. After serving mainly as garrison troops in the Atlantic coast, the Georgians had joined Johnston's army 6 weeks earlier and were eager to prove themselves in battle after Hardee's veterans derided them as holiday soldiers. When Lightburn's men moved out, the wooded, uneven terrain quickly disordered their battle lines and slowed the advance. Lightburn's men finally struck the Confederate picket line, and desperate hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Men on both sides fought with bayonets and clubbed muskets. After suffering 80 casualties, the Georgians fell back. Lightburn's troops pursued them through the open fields southwest of Pigeon Hill. With clear fields of fire, Mercer's Georgians poured heavy fire into the Union ranks and checked the advance. Afterward, Lightburn's men redirected their fire at Cockrell's reforming skirmish line, forcing the Missourians to retire. At that point, French ordered 3 rebel guns atop the crest to blast Lightburn's advancing troops. With shells from Pigeon Hill and musket balls from both sides of Burnt Hickory Road raining down on the survivors, Lightburn's Yankees were driven back. Skirmishers from Brigadier General Peter Osterhaus's division moved forward on Lightburn's right to support Logan's attack. Much like their fellow Yankees to the north, though, these men came under galling artillery and musket fire that halted their assault. When our defeated line came back over the breastworks, I saw a brave color bearer marching erect with his teeth set and the pallor of death spread over his face, wrote Major Charles Danham Miller of the 76th Ohio Regiment, who participated in the attack. In his left hand was gripped the flag of the regiment, which he was carrying to a place of safety, while his right arm was shot away with the blood streaming from the ragged stump. He held the colors erect until they reached their former position, then lay down and died. By 11 a.m., Logan's entire attack against Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill had been repulsed. The three assaulting brigades suffered a combined loss of nearly 600 men. They had nothing to show for their effort. Thomas's main assault in the Union Center got underway at around 9:30 a.m. Major General Oliver O. Howard instructed Brigadier General John Newton to send 3 of his 4 brigades against the ridge line in front of them, which became known thereafter as Cheatham Hill, after Major General Benjamin Cheatham, who commanded the troops in that sector. Howard told Newton to deploy the brigades of Brigadier Generals Charles Harker, George Wagner, and Nathan Kimball with their men in columns with the regiments of each brigade lining up one behind the other. His intent was that the columns would be able to punch through the rebel works. Wagner and Harker prepared to advance behind a skirmish line from Colonel William Gross's brigade of Major General David Stanley's division. Newton withheld Kimball's brigade as a reserve to be deployed as needed as the attack unfolded. Newton's Yankees were opposed by Major General Patrick Claiborne's veteran troops, as well as part of Cheatham's division to the south. Claiborne's defenders had erected an imposing array of obstacles in front of their position. The attacking force would have to traverse a branch of John Ward Creek, push through a tangled undergrowth, and confront a line of felled trees and sharpened stakes known as the chevaux de frise. No sooner had Newton's Yankees emerged from the protection of their lines than the Confederates opened up with all their artillery and musketry in that area. The Yankees were struck with shot and shell and musket balls. Claiborne and his veterans were hard fighters, and they were not about to make it easy for the attacking Yankees. Leaving a trail of dead and wounded in their wake, Wagner's men finally reached the obstacles in front of Claiborne's line. They attempted in vain to clear the impediments from their path. Color-bearer Henry Shedd of the 26th Ohio, whose regimental flag received 56 bullet holes during the course of the assault, wrote afterward that he believed Wagner's brigade got to within 20 yards of the works before the advance ended. As his men went to ground, Wagner received word that Kimball's brigade would soon be coming on his left. With the 36th Illinois out in front as skirmishers, Kimball's 6 other regiments pushed forward into the same difficult terrain and obstructions that were crippling Wagner's attack. The attack was swept by discharges of grape and canister, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Porter Olson of the 36th Illinois, adding that the Confederates' strong earthworks and heavy infantry fire made carrying Claiborne's works seem like an impossible task. After 2 long hours spent struggling through a field under heavy fire, Kimball's men could go no farther. Logan ordered Kimball to pull back his men to the main Union line, in itself a daunting proposition. The slaughter among our troops at this moment was even greater than when they had advanced, for the enemy now rose from behind their works, fearless of danger from the retreating force, and fired with greater precision than when the column had advanced, wrote Sergeant John Marshall of the 97th Ohio of Wagner's brigade. To the right of Kimball and Wagner, Harker and his troops were enduring their own ordeal. Harker, who was just 26 years old, had turned down a request to serve as Howard's chief of staff, a position that would have sheltered him from the dangers of the battlefield command. An injury he had suffered weeks earlier made it difficult for him to walk, so Harker rode into battle on a white horse, which made him a conspicuous target. Harker led 7 regiments, all of which were arrayed in column, forward toward the Confederate lines. They advanced behind a screen of skirmishers from Colonel Emerson Updike's 125th Ohio. Opdyke led his skirmishers forward and captured a good number of their Confederate counterparts. Harker's column also made good progress. As they neared Cleburne's works, only 600 yards from the Federal lines in the sector, rebel gunners depressed the muzzles of their 12-pounders to almost fully horizontal and switched from shell to canister ammunition. The lethal canister rounds struck wooden stakes and other obstructions in front of the trenches, sending shards of wood and other debris, as well as clouds of lead balls, into the oncoming Yankees. Seeing his line falter, Harker rode forward, raised his hat, and called for his men to follow his lead and carry the enemy's works. When he was within 10 yards of the trench, a musket ball struck his arm and passed into his chest. He tumbled from his horse, mortally wounded. The loss of Harker, as well as steadily mounting casualties, halted the attack. Command of Harker's brigade devolved to Colonel Luther Bradley of the 51st Illinois. Shortly after he assumed command, he received orders to pull back. By the morning of June 27th, the rebels of Cheatham's division had held their positions on Cleburne's left flank for a week, during which they had endured searing heat, artillery bombardment, and sniper fire. Cheatham had deployed Brigadier General Alfred Vaughan's brigade on the same ridge that Cleburne's mound held on June 19th, then extended Vaughan's line with the rest of his division on the night of June 20th. Because that ridge ended on a low hill next to a branch of John Ward Creek, the only suitable defensive ground for the rest of Cheatham's division was located farther to the east. Deployed on Vaughan's immediate left, Brigadier General George Manny had to bend back his own line. He placed one regiment on the southern edge of the hill, facing west toward the Union position, and then put his other regiments facing south. This created what became known as the dead angle. Toiling in the dark, Cheatham's engineers had mistakenly established the main trench 50 yards too far up the hill, which meant that many of the defenders on the hilltop could not see all of the ground to their front. 4 companies of the 1st 27th Consolidated Tennessee Regiment, totaling 180 men, held the section of the dead angle facing west, while Manny's other Tennessee regiments faced southward. 8 concealed artillery pieces were arrayed just south of the angle, and 2 more to the north, all positioned to enfilade any Union troops attacking the angle. Union artillery had blasted away some of the headlogs of the Confederate trenches at the dead angle, which meant that the rebels were not as well protected as some of their counterparts of the Confederate line. Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis, one of the division commanders in the Union 14th Corps, ordered 2 of his 3 brigades to assault Manny's position. Like other Union assaults that morning, Davis hoped to overwhelm the rebel works quickly by attacking in dense columns of regiments rather than in traditional long, thin lines. Having received their orders, Colonel Daniel McCook and Colonel John Mitchell formed their troops for the assault. In addition to their breastworks, Cheatham's rebels benefited from infantry obstacles in front of their positions, such as rows of sharpened stakes known as abatis, and also artillery unseen by the enemy that fired deadly canister at close range into the oncoming blue ranks. Despite these enhancements to their defenses, Cheatham's outnumbered defenses were hard-pressed to prevent being overrun by the rushing Yankee tide. However, they rose to the task. No sooner would a regiment mount our works than they were shot down or surrendered, and soon we had every gopher hole full of Confederate prisoners, wrote Watkins. Yet still the Yankees came. It seemed impossible to check the onslaught. With the leading regiments of the attacking brigades slowed by stout rebel resistance, those to the rear soon pushed to the front. As they advanced, Union soldiers leaned forward as if moving into a fierce wind or rainstorm. Slowed by the dense undergrowth and abatis on the slopes of Cheatham Hill, the blue line withered under heavy fire. On Vaughan's right, a pair of 12-pounders enfiladed the left flank of McCook's brigade, leaving the ground littered with dead and wounded Federals. On the other end of the Confederate line in that sector, 2 batteries pummeled McCook's right flank and fired directly into Mitchell's onrushing troops. Fire in the front and flank produced heavy casualties for the attacking brigades. A poor wounded and dying boy, not more than 16 years of age, asked permission to crawl over our works, and when he crawled to the top, and just as Blair Webster and I reached up to help the poor fellow, he, the Yankee, was killed by his own men, wrote Watkins. In fact, I have ever thought that is why the slaughter was so great in our front, that nearly, if not as many, Yankees were killed by their own men as by us. The brave ones who tried to storm and carry our works were simply between two fires. Rushing to the top of the Confederate parapet, Colonel McCook stood with his foot on the head log and used his sword to repulse the bayonets of the defenders beneath him. "Surrender, you damn traitors," he shouted, just before he was mortally wounded. As McCook was carried to the rear, command devolved to Colonel Oscar Harmon of the 125th Illinois. Harmon was also killed. When Colonel Caleb Dilworth of the 85th Illinois took command of the brigade, he allowed the troops to pull back a short distance to the protection of the so-called military crest, where Cheatham's engineers should have established their main works rather than the actual crest. Davis sent a dispatch to Thomas at 11 a.m., informing him that there was no hope of carrying the enemy's line. Newton did the same. Their two brigades had suffered a combined total of nearly 1,500 casualties. Thomas advised that those who could fall back to the main line should do so, but those who could not retreat without suffering additional casualties should wait for nightfall. The drop in intensity of the fighting came none too soon for Watkins and his comrades. When the Yankees fell back and the firing ceased, I never saw so many broken down and exhausted men in my life, he wrote after the war. I was as sick as a horse and as wet with blood and sweat as I could be, and many of our men were vomiting with excessive fatigue, overexhaustion, and sunstroke. Our tongues were parched and cracked for water, and our faces blackened with powder and smoke, and our dead and wounded were piled indiscriminately in the trenches. There was not a single man in the company who was not wounded or had holes shot through his hat and clothing. Many of Cleburne's and Cheatham's men taunted the retreating Yankees, screaming, "Chickamauga! Chickamauga!" because many of those attackers had yelled, "Missionary Ridge!" during the advance. On Johnston's extreme left, Brigadier General William Jackson of the Confederate Cavalry Corps had deployed 3 of his brigades astride the Sandtown Road south of Ollie's Creek crossing. Cox had devised a plan to get additional Union infantry brigades across Ollie's Creek and push south. The men of Byrd's brigade had crossed the previous day, a mile north of the Sandtown Road Bridge, and constructed a crude bridge at their crossing point. Early on the morning of June 27th, Colonel Daniel Cameron's brigade crossed the bridge and marched south to support a crossing by Colonel James Riley's brigade. The movement sparked little more than a skirmish as the outnumbered Confederate troopers discovered that 3 full Union brigades were now coordinating an advance. Cox had sent his brigades off at 4 a.m. He had pushed his troops relentlessly and had instructed his subordinates that he wanted them to achieve their objectives by 8 a.m. Cox's movement was meant to divert Johnston's attention from the main attack to his left. However, Cox's feint failed in that regard. Cameron's troopers pushed south to threaten Ross's troopers, while Riley successfully crossed Ollie's Creek at 5 a.m. All 3 rebel cavalry brigades ultimately fell back, after which Cox advanced to a high ridge a mile south of Ollie's Creek. At 8:30 a.m., Cox's Yankees had established a 4-mile-long line of battle with minimal casualties. Haskell deployed his skirmishers several times, losing about 100 men in the process. About the same time as the Union attacks to the north ground to a halt, Cox's brigades were entrenched on the ridge, which was the last obstacle between Ollie's Creek and Nickajack Creek. Upon hearing this good news, Sherman told Schofield to instruct Cox to remain on the defensive, but if attacked, to hold the valuable ground he had gained. Skirmishing continued throughout the rest of the day, with the rebel cavalry fighting dismounted behind hastily constructed earthworks. Brigadier General Lawrence Ross, who commanded one of the 3 rebel cavalry brigades, probed the Yankees with skirmishers to pinpoint Cox's position and to test its strengths. The gains achieved by Cox and his men on June 27th became the fulcrum for Sherman's next turning movement. Realizing he had been outflanked, Johnston abandoned his position at Kennesaw Mountain and on July 2nd fell back to a prepared position at Smyrna. He then withdrew to another prepared position on the north side of the Chattahoochee River that covered the bridges and the ferries leading to Atlanta. Despite the double repulse, Sherman was not done for the day. He wanted Thomas to renew his attack. My officers report the enemy's works exceedingly strong, in fact so strong that they cannot be carried by assault, except by immense sacrifice, even if they can be carried at all, Thomas responded. We have already lost heavily today without gaining any material advantage. 1 or 2 more such assaults would use up this army. At a cost of about 700 Confederate casualties to 300 Union casualties, Johnston had won a tactical victory, but he had not altered the strategic situation in any way. For his part, Sherman failed to achieve his primary tactical objective, which was to punch through the Confederate center. Nevertheless, Schofield's success against the Confederate left afforded Sherman an advantage that he exploited 5 days later. Johnston's method of fighting was not palatable for Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and he removed Johnston from command on July 17, 1864. Heavy attrition in the Confederate Army of Tennessee made it practically impossible for any commander, no matter how seasoned or how much of a fighter he was, to defeat the Union juggernaut fighting its way towards Atlanta. More misery awaited the Army of Tennessee, both in the trenches and around Atlanta on the forlorn march it would make into Tennessee as a last gasp under General John Bell Hood in the autumn of 1864. It's your history. Learn it, know it, and love it.